This is Art Sense, a podcast focused on educating and informing listeners about the past, present, and future of art. I'm Craig Gould. On today's episode, I speak with J.T. Ravize, who has spent the last 20 years fighting to authenticate a collection of Jackson Pollock paintings that could represent a missing period in the artist's work. We discuss the difficult process for authenticating any found piece of art, but especially the work of this particular artist. Regardless of whether or not you're a Pollock fan, it's an interesting story with no easy answers. So, J.T. Ravize, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast this week. J.T., I first met you at an art event in LA, and I was amazed by what you had because it looked just like a Jackson Pollock. And when I asked you, what is this? Your response was a Jackson Pollock. And then my head kind of spun. And JT, can you kind of explain to us, what we are looking at with the Wyoming Working Group? What is it that you have your hands on?
Thank you very much for having me on your show today, Craig. It was a pleasure to meet you. And as I've said to you before, I never, ever expected to be talking about this in public. I always thought it was going to be kind of a under the radar, low-key thing. And just the way things have worked out over 20 years now, which is unbelievable but true. Coming up in April will be 20 years that I've been researching this group of paintings along with my wife, and we are the business entity Wyoming Working Group, and we just picked that name because Jackson Pollock was born in Wyoming, and so seemed appropriate. And we live in Zephyr Cove, Nevada, which is on the Nevada side of Lake Tahoe. And my wife and I are pretty well known for doing landscape books, and her poetry is nationally recognized. And we do landscape photography and poetry about Lake Tahoe, and that is generally used as an advocacy tool, using art, poetry, photography to advocate on behalf of Lake Tahoe in Washington, D.C., and every day that we're here in Lake Tahoe. We just want people to take care of the place, and so we do our best to celebrate it with our books, and that's our, as I say, our day job. And then what's turned into night school of at least PhD 1 or 2 with respect to Jackson Pollock and his life and career and history and market. It's just something that a friend of mine, it started 20 years ago by a friend of mine saying, hey, I'm talking to this guy and his neighbor has some paintings by a guy named Pollock or something. And it literally started, and I said, maybe Pollock? And he goes, I don't know, he says Pollock. And which the old guy with his accent, how he used to say it, Jackson Pollock. And so anyway, that's how I started. And they said, hey, can you go down and take a look? His rancher neighbor has been kind of poking around for 3 or 4 years. And it's obvious when you look at the paintings on the wall and then look at Pollock's books and catalog raisonné, that it's most likely Pollock. And what's going on here? And you have a lot more experience in the art world than this other guy, so why don't you take a look? And that's basically how it started in April of 2002. And I went down with my wife, Linda, and looked at 4 paintings. And even though I didn't know that much about Jackson Pollock at the time, more than your average art interested person, I had been studying fractals, which are patterns in nature. I didn't know they were called fractals at the time. I was just interested in patterns in nature. And by studying them for a quarter of a century, I just come to understand patterns of nature. And so when I saw the paintings initially, it struck me that it wasn't random chaos that your cat or dog or 5-year-old kid could do, that there was something going on. And that's basically how it started. And so at this point in time, we're in Lake Tahoe, and I have amassed probably one of the world's best collections of Jackson Pollock literature, research, ephemera, books, exhibitions, catalogs, etc., just studying what this is all about. And so the bottom line is that a gentleman had a large collection of drip pour Pollock masterworks that he had for 50 years, the same consistent story. I got him from a girlfriend, not Ruth Klingman, a girlfriend or a friend that was a girl of Jackson Pollock's named Helen. And basically that was the story, that there was a young artist named Helen, which this is definitely part of the unraveling of this story and the peeling the onion layers, etc. Is there was always a name, Helen Rodfield, but as you know, this person who was a friend of Pollock's, lived in Greenwich Village, and that was the connection. But the closer I got to this guy's passing in 2014, this Mr. Nemeth was his name. And the older, more we got into this and the closer to his passing that he got, the more he would say Helen Frankenthaler. And so I, even after 20 years, don't know if this collection was going through the hands of two different Helens, or Helen Rodfield, which has always been like in the literature and in the stories and everything, or if it was also, or really, it was Helen Frankenthaler. So there's just the basic story, whole bunch of paintings that this lady had that Jackson Pollock had placed with her prior to the about to happen biggest museum show of his life, which had been given to him in 1956 by the board of directors at New York MoMA. Nelson Rockefeller at the time was the chair of the board, and they had something going on where they said, well, we want to do a series of midlife retrospectives, and we're going to start, our finalists are Picasso, Motherwell, and Pollock, and they chose Pollock, which brings up a really important part of this whole thing, which is the disconnect or disinformation that exists with respect to what Pollock was doing the last 3-4 years of his life. And it's one of the first questions out of the box is, why would the board of directors of the prestigious New York Museum of Modern Art, New York MoMA, give a show, midlife retrospective, to a guy that future tellings of his story in life, mostly Lee-Krasner, were, oh yeah, he was just drunk and he wasn't doing anything from 1953 to 56. A guy who had painted 40 to 50 paintings a year, and then he just, nope, he only painted 15 paintings. That's what's recorded in the catalog raisonné that was put together by Lee-Krasner, kind of, anointing and appointing Francis O'Connor and Eugene Thaw to do a 4-year process between 1975 and 1978 to pull together the, quote unquote catalog raisonné. This is what we know of Jackson Pollock's, career and life output. I've come to think of it much more as an exercise of exclusion rather than an exercise of inclusion with respect to the paintings that they included, which, they picked them, they wrote it, they photographed it, Yale University Press printed it in 1978, but it's the life of Jackson Pollock according to their, vision, their agenda. And so in my 20-year process of researching, what I've really found is that there is, quite a bit of a disconnect from the popular version that's been advanced over the last 50 years and is very institutionalized by now, whether it's, reference books or college textbooks or whatever. Here is the story of Jackson Pollock's life, and that's the way it is. And I would just have to beg to differ. So anyway, they put this document together, but I don't believe that it's accurate. I believe that something else was going on. All of this is informed by 20 years of research. I believe that Jackson Pollock was collecting or segregating a body of work from which he was going to make his final pulls for the show that was scheduled to take place in November of 1956. There was, what this collection constitutes or is made up of is a remarkable and large, huge. I've been tracking it down, the story and the people and the paintings, and there's at least 100 of some of the best or absolute best drip pour paintings of Pollock's life. That the story is he hand selected and had, with this younger artist friend girl, Helen, and nobody expected him on August 11th, 1956 to die in a car crash, but he did. And this young gal all of a sudden had a large stash of Pollock drip pour paintings. And the FBI interviewed Mr. Nemeth twice in 2012 about the story, the paintings. Did you paint them, all that? And he's like, no, I didn't paint them. If I did, I'd be famous and rich and everything. They're just a group of paintings that I got, and they came to me through a friend of the Helen or Helen's, and that was it. And so the FBI interviewed him twice and said, okay, they didn't find any reason to go any further and question his story, or they did their own research and came back with, well, okay, looks like what the guy's saying is accurate. So it's really odd, that especially Eugene Thaw and Francis O'Connor, who were, the godfathers, for sure, of the entire Pollock world and art market and kind of everything Pollock for many, many years, from the mid 70s until their passing in, 2018. I mean, they were the ultimate arbiter. They were the guys that you wanted to have and weigh in one way or the other if you really cared about somebody, weighing in and giving their appraisal or perspective or connoisseurship. They were the ones. And we spent well over a decade trying to get both of either Eugene Thaw and, in the case of Francis O'Connor, more than 15 years. No, it's both. Both of them were 15 years or more to come to the table with, no set parameters. Like, we just want you to come and look at these paintings and say what you want to say. And they would not do it. And so anyway, it's like, well, okay, if they're not going to do it, that's really odd. And how else would you go about the process of attempting to authenticate something that there was no formal authentication board for, due to its having disbanded in 1996. At the time, Bill Lieberman, Francis O'Connor, Eugene Thaw, Ellen Landau, comprised that Jackson Pollock Authentication Board from 1984 to 1996. It's my view and opinion after all these years that they knew most or all about this story and this collection. I believe, well, there's so many different tangents, and I'm hoping that we'll just kind of get into this and have a discussion today that we'll follow up on, because this really is a gigantic, huge story. The bottom line of which is, are these authentic Jackson Pollock? And there's we've done $2.5 million worth of research with the top scientists in the world since 2003.